The phone call came at 4 in the morning. The ICU nurse's voice was tight, almost trembling, and she said something I was certain I had misheard. She said Gary Dockery was awake. She said he was talking. I had been a neurologist for over 2 decades at that point, 22 years at Columbia Park Ridge Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I had built my entire professional identity around one belief above all others. The brain is knowable. It operates by rules. Those rules can be mapped, measured, and predicted. And when enough of the brain is destroyed, the person who lived inside it is gone. Not sleeping, not hiding, not waiting somewhere in the dark. Gone. I believed that with every fiber of my training, and on the night of February 12, 1996, that belief was dismantled completely. Gary Dockery had been my consultation patient for several years by then. I first came across his case in 1992, when I was recruited to head the neurology department at Columbia Park Ridge. Part of my responsibilities included reviewing long-term care patients throughout the region, cases where families were seeking second opinions or where neurological status had changed. Gary's file was among the first I studied. His story was already a tragedy before I entered it. In September of 1988, he had been a police officer in a small mountain town about 15 miles northeast of Chattanooga. He had only been on the job 3 months when he responded to a call that turned out to be a trap. A man with a grudge had made a false report to lure an officer to his door. When Gary approached the porch, the man fired a single shot at point-blank range into Gary's forehead. The bullet fragmented on impact, one piece lodging in his left frontal lobe, the other traveling toward the back of the skull. Emergency surgery lasted 8 hours. The team removed bone fragments, blood clots, and roughly 20% of his left frontal lobe. The bullet fragments themselves were left in place, too dangerous to extract. Gary survived, but never regained consciousness. By the time I reviewed his file in 1992, Gary had been in a persistent vegetative state for 4 years. I visited him at the nursing home on Signal Mountain. What I found was exactly what I expected. His eyes would open and close in sleep-wake cycles. He would occasionally grimace or groan. Sometimes his fingers would curl reflexively around a hand placed in his palm. Once in a while, he appeared to nod when asked a direct question. But none of it was consistent. None of it could be reliably reproduced. His family, his brother Dennis, his 2 sons, visited regularly and were convinced he understood them. They insisted he blinked once for yes and twice for no. They said he seemed more alert when they talked about familiar things, his horses, his memories from before the shooting. I listened carefully and respectfully, and I was certain they were wrong. I want to be honest about that. Not because they were foolish, they were devoted, loving people, but because that certainty is what you need to understand before I tell you what happened next. It was the foundation everything else stood on. The brain is knowable. The damage is documented. When the tissue is gone, the person is gone. I examined Gary multiple times between 1992 and 1995. Each time, the same clinical picture. EEG showing vegetative state patterns, no higher cognitive activity, no evidence of conscious thought. Brain scans confirming permanent, irreparable damage. By early 1996, after more than 7 years, his case had become routine for me. Periodic consultations, medication adjustments, guidance to the family. No expectation of change. Then the pneumonia hit. It started over the weekend of February 10th and 11th. Gary developed a severe respiratory infection, a common and often fatal complication for patients who are completely immobile. His condition deteriorated fast. By Saturday night, his fever was at 104 degrees, and he was struggling to breathe. He was brought to Columbia Park Ridge, where I was called in as consulting neurologist. When I examined him in the emergency department that night, his condition was critical. His neurological responses were even more minimal than usual. He wasn't showing even the occasional eye-tracking movements I had come to expect. I documented what I saw clearly. No signs of awareness, no response to stimulation, no indication of any change. I spent a long time that Saturday night with Dennis. He had been Gary's primary advocate for nearly 8 years, and the exhaustion in his voice was the kind that settles into bones after years of sustained grief. He was wondering quietly whether this was the moment to let his brother go. He asked me if Gary could hear them. I told him what I believed, gently, honestly. I explained that the damage made conscious awareness neurologically impossible, that what the family saw as responses were almost certainly reflexes, that the brain produces those behaviors even in the complete absence of any inner experience. Dennis thanked me. The family decided to proceed with aggressive treatment. Gary was admitted to the ICU, put on intravenous antibiotics, with lung surgery scheduled for Monday if his condition didn't improve. Sunday evening, I made my rounds. His fever had dropped to 101. His breathing was still labored, but he was beginning to stabilize. I noted in his chart, neurological status unchanged, minimal responses, no evidence of conscious awareness. I went home and slept. At 4 in the morning, the phone rang. The nurse said Gary was awake and alert, said he had been speaking with his sister for the past hour, said he was asking questions and responding normally to conversation. I told her I thought I had misunderstood her, and she repeated it word for word. I hung up and drove to the hospital faster than I should have, telling myself there was a rational explanation. A seizure producing unusual sounds, the family misinterpreting involuntary movements as speech. Anything that fit inside the world I understood. When I walked through the ICU doors at 4:45 in the morning, Gary Dockery was sitting up in his hospital bed having a conversation. I don't have words that fully capture that moment. The closest I can come is this. It was as if I walked into a room where gravity worked sideways, and I had to pretend to be calm about it. His eyes were open, focused, and tracking people around the room with obvious intelligence. When I approached his bedside, he looked directly at me and said, "Are you Dr. Kaplan? Lisa was just telling me I've got pneumonia. How serious is it?" I stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then I pulled up a chair. Over the next several hours, I conducted the most extraordinary neurological examination of my entire career. Gary's cognitive function was intact, not partially, not marginally, but fully and bewilderingly intact. He performed arithmetic. He recalled detailed memories from his past. He engaged in complex, contextually appropriate conversations about his family, his work, his animals. His speech was clear, grammatically correct, and his responses were those of a man who was completely present. His last clear memory was from a job he'd held before becoming a police officer, working security at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He had no memory of the shooting, no awareness that nearly 8 years had passed. When Dennis finally told him how long he had been unconscious, Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 7.5 years. That explains why I feel like I've been sleeping forever, and why the boys have grown so much. He asked about his sons by name, his horses by name, made jokes, wanted to know his treatment plan. When told the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Berlin Wall was down, he said, "Well, I guess I missed some important history." His family said it was his voice, his humor, his exact way of being, as they had always known him. Every specialist I could reach came in that Monday. Each one wore the same expression I'd had walking through that door, the expression of someone holding a fact that shouldn't exist. We ordered new brain imaging, blood work, every diagnostic tool we had. The results showed nothing new. The CT and MRI were identical to what had been documented for years. The missing frontal lobe tissue, the bullet fragments, the scarring and atrophy. No new growth, no healing, no physical change that could explain what Gary was doing. His EEG, which had shown vegetative patterns for years, now showed completely normal waking brain activity with clear evidence of conscious thought. Over the following days, Gary began to recede, gradually, like a tide pulling back. By Tuesday, he was speaking less often. By Wednesday, mostly short phrases and yes or no answers. On Thursday, the lung surgery went ahead as originally scheduled. When he came out of anesthesia, something had shifted. He was awake but no longer speaking in full sentences. When asked what time it was, he said, "Night," and it was mid-afternoon. 18 hours. That was how long Gary Dockery was fully conscious, after 7.5 years of silence. I spent the following months trying to explain it. The most plausible theory was that the pneumonia, the extreme fever, the antibiotics, the physiological stress of severe illness, had temporarily altered his brain chemistry in a way that allowed dormant neural pathways to briefly function. But when we tried to replicate those conditions, nothing happened. Gary stayed locked in his minimal state. Gary Dockery died in April of 1997, 13 months after those 18 hours. A pulmonary embolism. His death was not medically unexpected, but it landed on me in a way I had not prepared for. In the months between his awakening and his death, I couldn't stop thinking about the implication beneath the surface of everything I had witnessed. If Gary could wake up and immediately recognize every person in that room, recall their names, remember conversations, retain his personality and his humor and his love for his children, then what had been happening during those 7.5 years? When his family told me he was blinking responses to questions, when they described him tracking voices around the room, when they insisted he seemed more present when they talked about things he loved, what if they had been right the entire time? What if I had been wrong every single time I sat across from them and professionally, gently, told them they were seeing what they needed to see? That thought was more disturbing to me than anything else about this case, because it meant that the certainty I had offered those families, delivered as expertise, as kindness, as medical truth, may have been a profound failure. Not just with Gary, with how many others? I started second-guessing every vegetative patient I consulted on after that. I found myself wondering whether they could hear me, whether they understood what I was saying about their prognosis. 6 months after Gary's death, I was consulting on a young woman in a persistent vegetative state for 3 years after a car accident. As I explained to her family that her condition was permanent, I noticed what appeared to be a tear sliding slowly down her cheek. Before Gary, I would have written autonomic response, coincidental timing, without hesitation. I put the cap back on my pen and didn't write anything. I submitted my resignation 3 weeks later. My letter said I was leaving to pursue other opportunities. That was easier than writing the truth, that Gary Dockery had removed the floor from under everything I had spent 22 years building. I no longer trusted myself to hold a family's most desperate hope in my hands and tell them with authority what was and wasn't possible. I moved to a smaller city and opened a general practice. Routine medicine, diabetes, hypertension, preventive care, conditions with clear answers. I never took on another neurology case. But I never stopped thinking about those 18 hours. About Gary sitting up in that bed, asking me calmly how serious his pneumonia was, looking at me with eyes that were undeniably, impossibly alive. About Dennis's face when his brother called him by name for the first time in 7.5 years. About all the years that family had sat beside him in that nursing home, talking to a man the medical world had declared absent, telling him about the boys, about the horses, about the world turning without him, and believing, without a single piece of clinical evidence, that someone was listening. They were right. They were right, and I was wrong. And for all my training, all my brain scans and EEG readings and published consultations and professional confidence, I was the one who missed the truth. I don't know what Gary's experience was like during those silent years. I don't know whether he was fully aware the entire time, or whether those 18 hours were something else altogether, some brief return from a place our instruments were never built to detect. What I know is that something survived inside that devastated brain, something preserved, his memories, his personality, his love for his children, his humor, in a place I had authoritatively declared empty. That's what stays with me, not the medical impossibility of him waking up, but the possibility that he was always there, present, aware, waiting, perhaps, for someone to believe it. I think about it whenever I hear a physician speak with certainty about where consciousness ends. I used to speak that way. I was sure I knew where the boundaries were. Gary Dockery showed me, in 18 hours, that the boundaries are not where we drew them. And the most important truth you may ever encounter is the one you've already decided cannot exist.